The candles at Rosmere Hall had been burning since 4 o'clock, and by 9 the ballroom smelled of hot wax and hothouse lilies, and the particular sweetness of champagne poured too freely. 200 guests stood beneath the gilded cornice in silks, the color of ripe plums and pale gold, and against all of it, in the doorway, stood a woman in black. Not fashionable black. Not the deep violet black that a widow of means wore to signal both grief and taste. Plain black lace, cut from a gown 8 months old, its hem let down twice to hide the mended seam. Miss Cordelia Winslow had worn mourning to the betrothal ball of the man she had loved since she was 16 years old, because her father was 8 months dead and she owned no other presentable dress, and because she had told herself, walking up the drive in her aunt's borrowed cloak, that she would not give the room the satisfaction of watching her fail to attend. She had not expected to be handed a glass. She had not expected the toastmaster's voice to carry her name. Miss Blythe stood at the center of the room in ivory silk and Rosmere diamonds that were not yet legally hers, her hand resting on the sleeve of a tall man whose face Cordelia had spent 8 months teaching herself not to study. The Earl of Rosmere did not look at Cordelia. He had not looked at her once since she entered, which she understood, and which still cost her something to stand inside. The glass was cold in her gloved hand. The room had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it expects to watch someone fail. Cordelia lifted her glass. "To Miss Blythe," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hand did. "Who marries a good man, and to a house that has known too much sorrow, and deserves, at last, some joy." She drank. She did not look at him when she said it. She did look at him after. For exactly 1 heartbeat. And in that heartbeat something crossed the Earl of Rosmere's face that no one else in the room was positioned to see, and that Cordelia herself would spend the following months trying to name. What she did not yet know, standing in her mended black lace with the taste of champagne gone sour on her tongue, was that the man she had just publicly blessed had not chosen this marriage. He had been chosen for it, the way a debt is chosen for a ledger, and the toast she had offered him in front of 200 witnesses was the kindest thing anyone in that room had done for him in 3 years. Before you learn how Cordelia came to stand in that doorway, and what it eventually cost the Earl of Rosmere to answer her, it is worth pausing here, at the edge of the story, and asking you to stay a while. If a woman's quiet courage in a room built to humiliate her is the kind of thing you come to these stories for, you are in the right place tonight. 8 months before the ball, Dr. Aldous Winslow had died in the small back bedroom of his own house of a lung fever that had taken 3 weeks to finish what a hard winter had started. And his daughter had sat with him through all 3 weeks without once leaving the room for longer than it took to boil water. He had been the Rosmere family's physician for 11 years, called out at any hour for a fever in the nursery or a fall from a horse, paid modestly and thanked warmly, and when he died, the modest payments died with him. There had been no fortune to speak of. There had been, instead, a small stipend from the old Earl's will, long since exhausted, and a daughter of 22 with a fine mind, a good hand at needlework, and nowhere in particular to put either. Cordelia had gone to live with her father's sister, Mrs. Perrin, and Mr. Perrin, a modest landowner 3 miles from Rosmere, who kept a tidy house and a tidier ledger, and who had taken his niece in without complaint, though not without occasionally reminding her, gently, that a young woman of 22, without a portion, could not afford to be particular about her prospects. Cordelia had thanked him, and gone on being particular anyway, in the private, unspoken way of a woman who has already lost the thing she valued most, and has decided that pride is the only inheritance left to her. The county had never quite known what to make of Edmund Ashcombe. He was not a man given to dancing more than duty required, nor to the easy laughter that carried a young lord through most drawing rooms without effort. He was most often found, at any gathering large enough to permit it, standing a little apart near a window or a doorway, watching the room rather than moving through it, his shoulders set in the particular stillness of a man holding something steady by main force. The mothers of the county had spent 3 seasons calling him grave, and calling it becoming in an earl. Cordelia had spent longer than that, suspecting the stillness cost him more than anyone troubled to ask. She had known Edmund Ashcombe since she was a girl of 10, watching him ride past her father's garden gate on a pony too large for him, his jaw already set in the serious line it would keep for the rest of his life. She had known him as a young man, home from Oxford, quiet at assemblies, dancing correctly and rarely, more comfortable in his father's library than in any ballroom in the county. She had loved him for perhaps 6 years, without once permitting herself to say so, not to her father, not to her aunt, not even most nights to herself. It was a foolish thing to love an earl when one's own father drove a gig instead of a carriage, and Cordelia had prided herself, until the ball, on never once having been foolish about it in company. The invitation to the betrothal ball had come not from Edmund, but from the Dowager Countess, and it had come, Cordelia understood perfectly well, out of obligation rather than affection. Her father had saved the old earl's leg after a hunting fall, and had sat up 3 nights running with the dowager herself during a fever the year before he died, and a family that prided itself on its honor could not, in conscience, fail to invite the physician's daughter to a Rosmere occasion, however inconvenient her presence might prove. "You need not go," her aunt had said, turning the invitation over in her hands as though it might bite her. "No one would think less of you for pleading your blacks." "I will go," Cordelia had said, and had not been able to explain, even to herself, why the going mattered so much. In the 8 months since her father's death, Cordelia had not entirely set aside his work. She could not set a bone or dose a fever, but she had kept his small store of remedies in careful order, and twice a week she walked the lanes he had once ridden, carrying broth to old Mr. Hale, whose chest had never recovered from the winter, and sitting an hour with the Dunmore children while their mother lay in with a new infant, and mending what needed mending in houses that had no shillings to pay a seamstress. She did it quietly, without asking her uncle's leave beyond the first time, and without expecting thanks, because it was the last thread connecting her to the man who had taught her that a physician's daughter owed something to the people her father had spent his life tending, whether or not there was a fee attached to the owing. No one at Rosmere Hall knew of it. She had never once mentioned it in company, and would have been startled to learn that her uncle's coachman, who drove her on these rounds without being asked twice, had more than once remarked to the Rosmere stables that Miss Winslow did more good in a week than half the county's ladies managed in a season. On the afternoon before the ball, the Dowager Countess sat with her particular friend, Mrs. Colworth, in the small drawing-room at Rosmere, going over the guest list with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who has finally, after 3 anxious years, secured her family's future. "The physician's girl has been asked only out of what is owed her father," the dowager said, not troubling to lower her voice, for Mrs. Colworth was precisely the sort of friend before whom one did not trouble oneself. "Pray see that she does not linger near Edmund. She has been in love with him since she was in the schoolroom, and I will not have that particular tragedy playing itself out under Miss Blythe's nose on the very night we mean to announce the settlement." Mrs. Colworth murmured something sympathetic about the sadness of poor relations who did not know their place, and the dowager, satisfied, returned to the seating chart, where Cordelia Winslow's name did not appear at all, having been left, deliberately, for the lower table nearest the doors. Cordelia arrived the following evening in her mended blacks, having spent the afternoon unpicking her mother's old lace veil, kept these 10 years in a drawer for no occasion anyone could name, and working its border into the neckline and sleeves of her mourning gown, so that what had been plain became, at least to her own eye, something closer to deliberate. It was the only ornament she permitted herself. Her aunt had watched her sew it in and said nothing, understanding, as women of that house generally did, that a woman going into a room to be looked at and found wanting has a right to choose exactly how she will be found wanting. The ballroom, when she entered it, was everything Rosmere Hall could make of an evening built to announce a fortune. Candles by the hundred, banked in silver branches along every wall, their light doubled in tall mirrors brought down from the gallery for the occasion. An orchestra imported from Bath tuned quietly in the far corner. Hothouse lilies stood in urns taller than the footman who had carried them in, and the floor itself, waxed that morning, threw back the candlelight until the whole room seemed to shimmer faintly, like water. Miss Honoria Blythe stood at the center of it in ivory silk, laughing at something her mother had said. Diamonds at her throat that had been in the Rosmere family for 4 generations, and had never, until that week, left the strong room for a woman who was not yet a Rosmere by marriage. Cordelia found her way to the lower table near the doors, without needing to be shown it, understanding, from the placement alone, precisely how her presence had been weighed and accounted for. Edmund stood near the terrace doors for the better part of an hour, accepting congratulations with the particular stillness of a man enduring rather than attending his own celebration. And it was there, glancing once toward the entrance as a new wave of guests arrived, that he first saw her. She did not see him see her. She was occupied in the doorway with her aunt's cloak, and did not notice that the Earl of Rosmere had gone very quiet, mid-sentence, in the middle of a conversation with his own solicitor. "Your lordship," said Mr. Faircloth, the family solicitor, a dry, careful man who had drawn up more marriage settlements in that county than any man living, and who had been called to Rosmere that week to finalize the terms of the Blythe fortune before the wedding itself. "Forgive me," Edmund said, and did not explain what he had forgiven himself for, and turned back to the room, where his mother was already crossing the floor toward Miss Blythe with the particular satisfaction of a general reviewing a battle already won. The toast came an hour later, and Cordelia's part in it you have already heard. What the room did not see, because the room was watching Cordelia, was the exact moment Edmund's hand tightened on the stem of his own glass until his knuckles went pale, or the half-second in which he very nearly crossed the floor toward the doorway before catching himself and setting the glass down instead, untouched. "Sit down," he said instead. 20 minutes later, finding her alone near the terrace doors, where she had retreated to catch her breath, her face gone the particular gray of a woman who has just performed a great kindness at considerable cost to herself. "You have gone pale." "I am perfectly well, my lord." "You are not." He did not touch her. He drew a chair from against the wall and set it precisely where the draught from the terrace could not reach her, and stood beside it until she sat, which she did, because his voice, low and level, was not one she had ever learned how to refuse. "Someone will bring you wine." "I have had wine enough tonight, I think." Something that was almost the ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone before she could be certain of it. "Then something to eat. You will not faint in my mother's ballroom. She would never forgive either of us." He was gone before she could answer, and returned within minutes with a plate he had, she was fairly certain, fetched himself rather than summoned a footman to fetch, and set it on the small table beside her without a word, and stood a moment longer than propriety strictly required before some obligation elsewhere pulled him away. It was, Cordelia told herself later, nothing. A host attending to a guest who had gone pale. It meant nothing at all, and she repeated this to herself with great conviction the entire carriage ride home, and believed it rather less with every mile. Mrs. Blythe, who had watched the small scene from across the room with the sharp attention of a mother whose daughter's fortune depended on nothing going wrong, found occasion not an hour later to remark to a cluster of ladies near the refreshment table, in a voice pitched precisely to carry to where Cordelia stood mending the torn hem of her glove. Poor thing, still playing the physician's girl in her blacks, toasting a marriage as though her opinion of it were wanted. One almost pities her presumption. The ladies near her laughed the small, complicit laugh of women who understand exactly which side of a room they are meant to stand on, and Cordelia finished mending her glove and did not look up, and told herself that a woman who had sat 3 weeks at her father's deathbed could survive a sentence spoken by a stranger's mother at a ball. She was not entirely certain, walking out to the carriage that night, that she had told herself the truth. It was a fortnight later, riding the long way home from the parish church, rather than the short way past the Blythe family's rented house, that Edmund came upon Nan Tilby's cottage at the edge of the Rosmere home farm, and drew rein without quite meaning to, because there was a woman's voice coming through the open window, low and steady, reading aloud. Nan Tilby had been nurse to 3 generations of Ashcombs, had rocked Edmund himself to sleep as an infant, and had been failing since the autumn with a cough that would not clear and a cottage that grew colder every week the estate's finances tightened. Edmund had meant 12 times to see that more coal was sent to her, and had been too occupied with solicitors and settlements to see it done. Cordelia had not been too occupied. She sat now at the old woman's bedside with a worn volume of sermons open on her knee, reading in the unhurried voice she had used. Edmund understood suddenly, at her own father's bedside not so many months before, and when she finished the chapter, she did not rise to go. She reached instead for her own shawl, the good wool one, and tucked it around Nan Tilby's shoulders over the thin blanket, and said something too quiet for Edmund to hear from the lane, and the old woman laughed, a dry, rasping laugh, and patted Cordelia's hand. Before she rose to go, Cordelia set the sermon book aside and took up a small basket she had brought with her, drawing out a twist of paper containing the last of a dried herb mixture her father had once favored for a cough, and showed Nan Tilby exactly how much to steep and how often, speaking to her not as a servant, but as a woman entitled to the same careful explanation any physician's patient deserved. Nan Tilby, who had buried a husband and outlived 2 of her own children, took the little paper twist in both hands as though it were worth a great deal more than it was, and said something Edmund could not hear that made Cordelia laugh, low and unguarded, a sound he realized he had never once heard from her in a drawing-room. He sat his horse in the lane a long while after that, watching a woman who did not know she was watched give away the warmest thing she owned to a servant who could do nothing for her in return, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man realizing something he had been refusing to admit for weeks, that he had built an entire argument for marrying Honoria Blythe on the premise that duty and feeling could not both be satisfied, and that the premise was a lie he had told himself, because the truth was harder to carry. On her way out through the kitchen garden, Cordelia paused, as she always did, at a climbing rose grown wild and half forgotten against the south wall, its white blooms just opening in the early warmth. Her father had grafted it there the year the old Earl was born, a small private gift between 2 men who had liked each other more than either had ever troubled to say aloud, and he had brought her to see it every spring of her childhood, calling it nothing in particular, only telling her that a good thing did not need a grand name to be worth keeping. She touched one bloom now, lightly, the way she touched most things that had belonged to a world with her father still in it, and did not see the horseman still watching from the lane. He did not speak to Cordelia that day. He rode home instead, and that evening, alone in his father's old study among ledgers he had not balanced in 3 years, he permitted himself, for the first time since the funeral, to remember exactly how his father had died. The old Earl had put the estate into a canal scheme in the spring of Edmund's final year at Oxford, certain, as ruined men are always certain, that this single investment would restore what a decade of poor management had already lost. When the canal company collapsed within the year, he had gone to the tables to recover it, and lost more. Edmund had been 3 counties away, buried in his studies, writing his father cheerful letters about examinations, while the estate bled out beneath him, and had come home only when a groom rode through the night to fetch him. Too late to do anything but sit with his father through the single day that remained to him after the fall. His father had broken his back taking offense at speed in the dark, riding home drunk from a gaming house 40 miles distant, and had lingered, half-conscious, for one long day before the end. Edmund had arrived to find Dr. Winslow already there, coat off and sleeves rolled, doing what could be done for a man past saving, and it was Dr. Winslow who had told him, gently and without evasion, that the night ahead would be the last one, and had stayed at the bedside himself until nearly dawn, rather than leave a dying man to a household of servants too frightened to sit with him. Edmund had never forgotten it, and had never, until this evening in the lane outside Nan Tilby's cottage, properly connected the physician who had sat with his father to the daughter who now sat with everyone else's dying and asked nothing for it. In the last clear hour before the end, his father had gripped Edmund's hand with a strength that had frightened him more than the injury itself. "Make it whole again," the old man had said, his voice already thinning. "Whatever it costs you. Promise me. The name. The tenants. Make it whole." Edmund had promised, because a man promises his dying father whatever is asked of him, and he had spent 3 years since believing that promise meant precisely one thing, that he must marry a fortune large enough to clear the debts and restore the roofs and pay the tenants what was owed them, and that his own preference in the matter was a luxury the estate could no longer afford him. What he did not yet know, remembering it, was that his father had not asked him to marry money. His father had asked him to make the house whole, and a house, Edmund was beginning to understand, watching a woman in mended black lace give her shawl to a dying servant, could be made whole by something other than a settlement drawn up by Mr. Faircloth. Here, before the story turns toward its harder weather, allow one moment's pause. If you have ever carried a promise made to someone you loved and mistaken its true shape for years afterward, you already know exactly where this is going, and I am glad, whatever you carry, that you are here to see how it comes out. It was Peggy, the housemaid who cleaned the upstairs corridors and who had a soft spot for the physician's daughter dating back to the winter Dr. Winslow had set her brother's broken arm without charging a farthing, who brought Cordelia the news 3 days later, breathless from having run the better part of a mile to do it. Her ladyship told his lordship plainly, "Miss, not an hour ago," in the blue drawing room. I was dusting the passage and could not help but hear. She said the physician's girl has no place at Rosmere anymore, and he must see that she is sent off well before the wedding, before folks start talking worse than they already are. Cordelia thanked her and gave her a coin she could not entirely spare, and told herself, walking home along the hedgerow with her basket of mending, that she had known this was coming from the moment she accepted the invitation, and that a sensible woman would feel nothing at all upon hearing it confirmed. She felt instead as though someone had removed a floorboard she had been standing on without knowing it was there. The confrontation itself came at the Rosmere Spring Assembly, held in the village hall rather than the great house, but attended by enough of the same company that the Dowager Countess considered it very much her own territory. Cordelia had come only because her aunt insisted a full season of hiding would draw more comment than a single evening endured, and she had worn, again, her mended blacks, having no other gown that answered. The Dowager found her near the refreshment table, where a servant had just handed Cordelia a glass of negus, and crossed the room with the particular smoothness of a woman who has planned every word in advance. "Miss Winslow." The Dowager's voice was pitched for the room, not for Cordelia alone. "How devoted you are to your blacks. One begins to wonder whether you mean to wear them the rest of your life, in hopes someone will mistake devotion for delicacy." "I wear them for my father, my lady," Cordelia said quietly. "I had not thought the matter required an audience." "No," the Dowager agreed. "I imagine you had not." And in reaching for her own glass, she contrived, with a precision that could not entirely have been accident, to catch Cordelia's elbow, so that the negus in Cordelia's hand went sliding down the black lace at her bodice in a dark, spreading stain. The room, which had been half attending already, went fully silent. A fiddler in the far corner, mid-phrase, let the note die rather than finish it. Mrs. Colworth, standing near enough to have caused it herself, pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. Even the servants at the refreshment table had gone still, a jug of negus held suspended halfway to a glass. "How clumsy of me," the Dowager said, not troubling to sound as though she meant it. "Perhaps it is a mercy the gown is already black. It will hardly show." Cordelia set the glass down with a steadiness that cost her everything she had left, and did not cry, and did not answer, and walked from the hall with her chin at the same angle her father had taught her to hold it. When a patient's family blamed him for a death, he could not have prevented, and it was not until she reached the lane outside that her hands began, finally, to shake. She wrote to her old governess's sister in Yorkshire the following morning, a Mrs. Aldous who kept a school and had twice before mentioned a need for an assistant teacher of good family and modest means, and by the end of the week the position was hers, to begin the first week of June, a fortnight before the wedding at Rosmere. "Yeah, you need not go so far," her uncle said, not unkindly, over a supper she barely touched. "There are positions nearer home." "There are not positions nearer home that do not require me to watch it," Cordelia said, and her aunt reached across the table and took her hand, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that would not have been a lie. She began to pack the small trunk that had come with her from her father's house, folding into it the few things that were entirely her own: her father's medical case with its worn leather straps, a miniature of her mother painted before Cordelia could remember her, 3 books, and a small tin box of seeds her father had saved from his own garden, unlabeled now, their names known only to him, and lost with him. It took less time than she expected to reduce a life to a single trunk, and she found that fact more sorrowful than any single object inside it. It was there, 3 days before she was to leave, that Edmund found her, having ridden to the Perrons' house on a pretext about a book her father had once lent him that he claimed, unconvincingly, to be returning. "You are leaving," he said, standing in the small parlor doorway with the book still in his hand, unopened, clearly never the true purpose of the visit at all. "Yorkshire," Cordelia said, not turning from the trunk. "A school. It is a good position." "Eat something before you decide anything," he said, which was not what either of them had expected him to say, and which made her laugh, briefly and painfully, because it was such a small, stubborn, entirely Edmund thing to say to a woman packing to leave the county forever. "I have already decided, my lord. The decision was rather made for me." By my mother. By everyone, Cordelia said, and finally turned to face him, and found she could not, after all, keep the truth entirely out of her voice. I toasted your bride at your own betrothal because it was the only honest thing I could do in that room, and I have been paying for the honesty of it ever since, and I find I have not the strength to go on paying. I wish you and Miss Blythe every happiness. I mean that. I have always meant it. Yet I cannot stay to watch it made. Edmund was silent long enough that she believed he meant to leave without answering, and instead he crossed the small parlor in 3 steps and stood before her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, and did not touch her, though his hand, she saw, had curled at his side as though it wanted to. I have signed nothing yet, he said. The settlement is not finalized. It wants only Faircloth's ink. That is not the same as unmaking it. No, he agreed, low. It is not. Not yet. He left without another word, taking the unreturned book with him, and Cordelia finished packing her trunk with hands that would not entirely stop trembling, and told herself, for the second time that spring, something she did not entirely believe. The settlement signing was fixed for the evening before the wedding, in the Rosmer ballroom itself, the same room hung again with candles, and the same orchestra engaged for what the Dowager Countess had described to every acquaintance in the county as a small, private celebration of the contracts, ahead of the larger festivities to follow at the church. Mr. Faircloth arrived at 7 with the settlement papers in a leather case, and Mrs. Blythe arrived at past. Luminous with a satisfaction 3 years in the making, her daughter beside her in blue silk that suited her a good deal better than the ivory had. Honoria Blythe herself had said little all evening. Dressed carefully in blue silk her mother had chosen, and had spent the better part of the hour before the signing watching Edmund across the room with an expression that was not heartbreak so much as a kind of tired recognition. The look of a woman who had suspected for weeks what tonight would only confirm, and had not yet found the courage to say so aloud to a mother who had built 3 years of hope on the marriage. Cordelia was not present. She had said her farewells to Rosmer the day before, quietly, to no one but Nan Tilby, and was to leave for Yorkshire at first light, her trunk already strapped to the top of the mail coach that would carry her from the village at dawn. It was Peggy, again, breathless again, who found her at the Perrons gate an hour before that, having run the whole way in the dusk with her cap half off and her apron still on. "You must come, miss. You must come now, if you are ever coming at all." "Peggy, I have said my goodbyes." "He has stopped it, miss. Faircloth had the papers laid out, and his lordship stood up before the whole room and would not sign. He is asking for you. Her ladyship is white as a sheet, and Mrs. Blythe looks fit to faint, and nobody in that ballroom has stopped talking since, and I ran the whole way to fetch you because I thought, miss, I thought you would want to know before you were gone for good." Cordelia stood a long moment in the gathering dark with her hand still on the gate, and then, without waiting for her cloak, without waiting for the sense of it, walked as fast as her half-boots would carry her the 1.5 miles back to Rosmer Hall, arriving at the ballroom doors with her hair coming loose from its pins and her breath tearing in her chest, to find the room exactly as Peggy had described it, candle-lit and frozen, every face turned toward the center of the floor, where Edmund stood with Mr. Faircloth's unsigned papers on the table beside him, and his mother's hand gripping his sleeve as though she might yet hold him in place by force. "Edmund," the dowager said, low and urgent, "you will disgrace this family in front of every soul we know. I have spent 3 years disgracing myself in private, mother, to spare this family a scandal it does not deserve to be spared." He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The room had gone so still that his ordinary speaking tone carried to every corner of it. "I made a promise to my father that I mistook for years. He did not ask me to sell myself to the highest settlement Faircloth could draft. He asked me to make this house whole. And I have finally understood that a house is not made whole by a fortune signed into it under duress. It is made whole by the people it shelters, and by what they are worth. And I have spent 3 years pretending not to know who, in this county, is actually worth something. Mrs. Blythe had gone the color of the papers on the table. Honoria, beside her, had gone very quiet, and something that looked almost like relief was moving, carefully hidden, at the corners of her mouth. It was at that moment that the ballroom doors opened, and Cordelia stood in them, breathless, her hair loose, no black lace on her tonight but a plain gray traveling gown she had meant to wear onto the mail coach at dawn, and every head in the room turned toward the same doorway that had frozen them all once before, at a betrothal that would not, after tonight, ever be finalized. Edmund crossed the ballroom floor in perhaps 8 strides, and the room, entirely unlike the last time it had watched Cordelia stand in that doorway, made way for him without a sound. He stopped before her, close enough now that only she and the nearest witnesses could hear him clearly, though the words would be repeated in that county for a generation. I choose Cordelia. I have always chosen Cordelia. Somewhere behind him, Mr. Faircloth quietly closed the leather case and set it on the table, and did not open it again that night. For a long moment no one in the ballroom moved at all. Then, from somewhere near the terrace doors, an elderly gentleman Cordelia recognized as a magistrate of the county began, very quietly, to applaud. And though he stopped almost at once, as though uncertain whether the room would permit it, a ripple of something warmer than scandal had already begun to move through the crowd. A woman near the punch table murmured to her neighbor that she had always thought the physician's daughter had more sense than half the young ladies presented that season, and the neighbor, who a month before had laughed at Mrs. Blythe's cruelty without a second thought, found she could not disagree. The Dowager Countess did not faint, and did not weep, though her hand, when Cordelia glanced at it, had gone entirely still upon the back of a chair. All its earlier certainty drained out of it at once. She stood a long moment looking at her son and at the woman he had crossed the room for. And something in her face, hard set for 3 years around the single fixed idea of what her family required to survive, seemed at last to give way, not into warmth exactly, but into the particular exhaustion of a woman who understands she has been wrong and has not yet decided how to say so. You have made your choice, then, she said finally, to Edmund, though her eyes had not left Cordelia. I hope you have made it with your eyes open. I have made it with my eyes open for the first time in 3 years, Edmund said. Mrs. Blythe recovered her voice first among the guests, sharp with wounded pride, and demanded to know what was to be done about the settlement, the dowry already discussed, the arrangements already half made with the dressmaker and the church, and it was Honoria herself, quiet until now, who laid a hand on her mother's arm and said, in a voice pitched only for her family to hear, that she had never once been asked whether she wished to marry a man who looked at another woman the way Lord Rosmere had just looked at Miss Winslow, and that she, for one, would rather go home to Bristol with her dignity than stay in this county married to a kindness she had never actually been offered. It was not the graceful surrender of a rival humbled for the crowd's satisfaction. It was, Cordelia thought, watching her go, the quiet relief of a woman who had been offered an escape she had not known how to ask for herself, and she found, to her own surprise, that she wished Honoria Blythe nothing but good in whatever came next. The wedding that had been arranged for the following morning did not take place, though a wedding, in its proper season, eventually did, quiet and small, and held not in the ballroom, but in the little parish church where Cordelia's father had been buried. with Nan Tilby propped in the front pew on borrowed cushions and Peggy weeping happily near the door, and the Dowager Countess, dressed in Rosmere gray rather than morning black, standing where a mother stands, her face composed at last into something that might, in time, become genuine welcome. Cordelia wore, that morning, a plain cream gown with a single thin border of black lace at the cuffs, her mother's veil worn down to its last usable inches, and no one in the church thought to ask why a bride on her wedding day chose to carry any trace of mourning at all. Her uncle, giving her away, held her hand a moment longer than the ceremony required, and said nothing, because there was, again, nothing that needed saying. It was the following spring, a full year after the toast that had begun it all, that Edmund led Cordelia out to the south wall of the Rosmere Gardens on a soft afternoon thick with the smell of turned earth, to the same climbing rose he had once watched her touch, without knowing she was watched, half forgotten, grown wild against the old brick. "Your father grafted this," he said. "For mine, the year I was born. I found the note in his old accounts. He never told me what it was called." "He called it nothing in particular," Cordelia said, running her gloved fingers over a single white bloom just opening in the warmth. "He said a good thing did not need a grand name to be worth keeping." Edmund cut the bloom carefully at the stem and set it in her hand. And that evening, in the quiet of the room that had once been her father's study and was now entirely her own, Cordelia pressed it between the pages of her father's old ledger, beside a line in his careful hand recording a graft taken and given away, freely, to a house he had spent his whole life quietly serving, and closed the book and set it on the shelf where it would stay. She kept, too, folded in the same drawer, a small square of black lace cut from the gown she had worn to a betrothal ball a year before, not out of grief any longer, but as a woman keeps the coat she wore through a hard winter, warm now only in memory, proof that she had stood in a doorway once and had not looked away. If Cordelia's evening in that black lace gown moved you tonight, I hope you will carry a little of her steadiness with you when you next find yourself standing somewhere you were not expected to belong.